Mena-Watch, the independent Middle East think tank. Welcome to Mena-Watch. My name is Zehden, and my guest today is Stephan Grigat. A warm welcome and thank you so much for taking the time. You are the Professor of Theories and Critique of Antisemitism at the Catholic University of North Rhine-Westphalia. There, since 2022, you've been heading the Center for Antisemitism and Racism Studies, CARS, in Aachen and Cologne. On one hand, you are an expert on the Middle East and Iran. In 2007, you co-founded Stop the Bomb, a significant campaign, and served as its scientific director in Austria until 2021, holding this pivotal role since its inception and contributing extensively to the field. On the other hand, your professional work deals with anti-Semitism and racism. Both topics are highly relevant today, and I'd like to talk with you about both. To kick things off today, let's dive right into the current critical issues at hand. Let's take a quick look at the Iranian Ayatollah regime. What kind of influence does it exert in the Middle East? Built through its support of terror, and from where does this influence originate? Through money, religion? What are the reasons?
The Iranian regime unfortunately wields a massive amount of influence, not only throughout the Middle East, but truly, I believe, on a global scale. One must grasp that this regime, which ascended to power in Iran in 1979 through the Shah's overthrow, harbored the conviction from its very beginning, deeply embedded in its ideological framework, that the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamic Revolution, was explicitly and unequivocally destined for export beyond its national borders, and this has remained their guiding principle. From the very beginning, they have pursued precisely such a policy, even in the 1980s, a period that was heavily shaped by the Iran-Iraq war at that time. Despite the ongoing conflict, they started attempting to export the revolution quite early on. This means that within a mere few years after the revolution, and truly almost immediately following its conclusion, efforts to destabilize began, predominantly targeting the Sunni Arab nations. The ultimate goal was to establish a model there, meticulously crafted after the Iranian model, the model of the Islamic Revolution, and the model of Welāyat-e Faqīh. That's the specific political model installed in Iran after 1979, which they also sought to establish there, extending its influence. For a significant period, these efforts initially proved unsuccessful. These attempts at overthrow did not succeed primarily because the Sunni Arab nations, particularly Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, staunchly resisted them. They did so through severe repression, actively moving against Khomeini's followers within their own borders. Nevertheless, it had a profound and immediate impact from the outset. This was due to the fact that in those Sunni Arab countries, the reform endeavors that were quite present at the time, namely the attempts to socially and politically establish a far more moderate reformation of Islam, were subsequently rolled back and reversed. This is especially clear when we look at the example of Saudi Arabia. If you look at pictures from Saudi Arabia before 1979, you see women in relatively light clothing, you see people going to the movies. Thus, it was a profoundly different situation compared to the 80s, 90s, and recent decades, during which an extremely conservative manifestation of Islam and Islamism dominated Saudi Arabia. This is a direct consequence of Iran's revolution export, primarily because Saudi Arabia feared that it would now be forced into direct competition with this emerging, novel and politically charged form of Islamic governance. The first instance where this revolution export truly succeeded Iran was not deterred by the initial setbacks and failures they encountered. They continued their attempts. The very first instance where this truly succeeded was, in fact, in Lebanon, through the establishment of Hezbollah. And there we have our initial point. The Iranian regime relentlessly employs every available resource to disseminate its ideology, political agenda, and even its military might throughout the Arab nations. Hezbollah was founded in the 1980s, and it was truly a creation of the Iranian regime. Thus, under the direct guidance of the Revolutionary Guards, this organization was established from a very specific situation in Lebanon, a nation engulfed in total chaos due to civil war and other similar circumstances. But that is considered the first successful export of the revolution. And this was subsequently taken as an example to attempt to set in motion quite analogous developments across numerous other Arab nations, as well as within the Palestinian territories. Again, for a relatively long time, this was not very successful, it must be said. It achieved massive success as a direct consequence of the 2015 nuclear agreement, or rather, it gained significant traction even during the preliminary negotiations that preceded it. The negotiations for this nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, also known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was adopted in 2015, had, I would say, utterly catastrophic consequences, as we will certainly elaborate on later. As a result of the negotiations for the nuclear deal, and then especially after the deal was actually put into effect, the Iranian regime has become extremely adept at exporting its revolution and its ideology throughout the region. The situation we encountered on October 7, 2023, where Israel found itself virtually encircled by Iranian proxies, a strategy ominously referred to as the mere ring of fire, when a fiery ring intended to be cast around Israel truly manifested as a stark reality during that very period. We can also very clearly identify who within the Iranian regime spearheaded this: Qasem Soleimani, who was then the leader, the head of the Quds force of the Revolutionary Guards. This is precisely that unit, the Quds Brigades. Quds means Jerusalem in Arabic. The name itself makes it very clear what they are actually aiming for. These are the units of the Revolutionary Guards responsible for foreign operations. And Qasem Soleimani, a highly charismatic and immensely popular leader within Iran, particularly among regime loyalists, explicitly formulated this ring of fire concept, and subsequently, following the nuclear deal, he was able to point to significant successes. He could proudly declare the revolution, and he made this public. For a time, this was even available on the English-language website of the Revolutionary Guards. He boasted that the Iranian Revolutionary Guards didn't just have authority in Tehran, which is accurate because the Revolutionary Guards are not merely some criminal enterprise or just one group within the regime, but are truly the most crucial, the preeminent, and ultimately the dominant group. He could proudly assert that the Revolutionary Guards held sway not only in Tehran, but also in 4 Arab capitals. In Lebanon, due to Hezbollah having de facto seized power, and in Syria, still under Assad at that point, who, during the civil war, could only maintain his grip on power through the unwavering support of Hezbollah and the Iranian regimes. So, without their support, he would have been overthrown much sooner. In Baghdad, pro-Iranian militias clearly held sway, and in Sana'a, the Yemeni capital, the group Ansar Allah, mostly known in Germany as the Houthi rebels, had established itself as a relatively new proxy and direct, potent ally of the Iranian regime. This strategic build-up significantly extended the regime's influence across the region, further solidifying its power. Those are the 4 Arab capitals, and Qasem Soleimani at that time went on to state, this was also briefly featured on the Revolutionary Guards English-language website, the next Arab capital we shall seize is Amman, meaning Jordan. And I think that very clearly shows you the underlying considerations and thought process behind this ring of fire strategy. Interestingly enough, they took it offline very, very quickly because I believe it was a bit too sensitive for them to openly announce their intention to destabilize Jordan, and they subsequently removed the statement. However, I still possess the screenshot. This refers to that very ring of fire strategy. This primarily constitutes a military expansion, signifying that they extensively supported, financed, and heavily armed militant groups positioned strategically around Israel. All of that did transpire. Still, there's always that underlying religio-political component that truly encompasses both aspects. On a religious level, there are sometimes indeed difficulties because this conflict between Shiites and Sunnis, which is often overestimated in the West but nevertheless certainly exists, is present. So the Iranian regime is clearly Shiite and Hezbollah is as well. However, some of the other allies of the Iranian regime are certainly not, you see. And there you can immediately perceive distinct differences, for example, with HAMAS. Hamas is a Sunni organization that comes from the tradition of the Muslim Brotherhood. In essence, this is the Palestinian faction of the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization that was established in Egypt way back in 1928. They are indeed close allies of the Iranian regime. However, by now, one could almost say those were alliances, but despite that, there were certainly undeniable conflicts that emerged between them, creating significant friction. And because of that, which was very clear during the Syrian civil war, there was at times even a rift between Hamas and the Iranian regime, because the Iranian regime clearly said, we support Assad. We ensure that he remains in power, because he has been a crucial element of their self-proclaimed axis of resistance, which is what they call themselves. And Hamas, having originated from the Muslim Brotherhood's tradition, actually aligned itself with the Islamist opposition against Assad. This truly led to a genuine rift, albeit for a temporary period, spanning several years. They overcame that, holding a big reconciliation meeting in Tehran. Because of this very situation, Iran then went on to support and promote additional groups within the Palestinian territories. One of the groups that also played a crucial role on October 7th was the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which I think is mentioned far too little in German reporting. They were, plain and simple, taking orders from Tehran, so they implemented Tehran's interests much more directly than Hamas did, and one could go through the different allies like that. Some are clearly aligned with the Iranian regime, not just politically, but also religiously, while for others it's more complex. Nevertheless, even groups like the PFLP, organizations stemming from left-wing nationalism and Marxism-Leninism, also find themselves cooperating with the Iranian regime. So it's quite evident that this religious alignment isn't strictly indispensable. As long as the common goal is opposition to Israel, they pretty much see eye to eye.
Then I can immediately follow up with a question regarding the new Syrian strongman Ahmed al-Sharar. Well, he is an Islamist, isn't he? Along with the HTS militia, he actually defeated the former president, Bashar al-Assad. So, what exactly is his current position regarding Iran then?
First and foremost, I think it's crucial to point out that HTS and al-Sharar didn't depose Assad on their own, which is quite fortunate given that other factions, including less radically Islamic ones and even those entirely secular or non-Islamist, played a part in that endeavor. But undoubtedly, the HTS militia is truly the dominant power in this whole situation. And yes, these are people who ultimately come from Al-Qaeda-style Islamism. But that also means they don't just stand critically opposed to the Iranian regime. They absolutely despise, detest, and revile it from the bottom of their hearts, actively fighting and taking action against it. On the one hand, due to the religious, ideological, and political differences that have always existed, and on the other, simply from the experience of recent years, the Iranian regime was, as I said, the most important pillar of support for Assad. Indeed, without Iran's crucial support, Assad would most likely have been ousted right at the civil war's onset, given that the opposition against him, which was still quite diverse at that time, possessed considerable strength and would have likely swept Assad from power. There's a definitive standoff. Very recently, there have been reports that militias, who strikingly resemble veteran al-Qaeda fighters, and whose tradition stems directly from that, are being redeployed to the Syrian-Iraqi border. This strategic move is intended to intercept and prevent pro-Iranian militias, potentially originating from Iraq, from attempting to traverse through Syria to reach the Israeli border. Thus, in numerous respects, it's quite an absurd situation. To be precise, these people are now actively defending Israel, and there are several other factions involved as well. It's truly a strange, or at the very least, a quite remarkable development unfolding before our eyes. And Israel, quite rightly, after al-Sharar came to power, assumed this posed a significant threat to them. So I believe they very justifiably ensured that the massive military potential remaining in Syria from the old Syrian army was completely neutralized. This was to prevent those capabilities from falling into the wrong hands, which was a very sensible and necessary measure on their part. At this point, I'd say it's still quite challenging to really determine the direction this is heading in. This is someone from an Islamist background. One cannot be too suspicious, skeptical, or critical of such individuals. Nevertheless, it's essential to acknowledge certain emerging developments. One significant aspect is that al-Sharar has expressed a stance where he doesn't entirely dismiss the possibility of reaching some form of understanding with Israel, perhaps not a full peace, but at least a kind of ceasefire agreement. There's considerable speculation, heavily influenced by Saudi Arabia's sway over al-Sharar and others like him, that Syria could potentially align itself with the Abraham Accords, an action that would undeniably represent a monumental stride. Whether that is actually the case and how much of it is mere masquerade or a genuine shift, I would say it's quite difficult to foresee at this current moment in time. However, returning to the core question, it is unequivocally clear that the pro-Iranian axis has been significantly debilitated by the overthrow of Assad. Furthermore, the current Syrian regime stands in explicit opposition to Iran and by extension to Hezbollah as well.
But not against Turkey.
No, exactly, and that clearly shows you nothing here is truly good or unproblematic, but it is unequivocally very different than it was before. That's one way to describe it.
Let's return to Iran. How far advanced was their nuclear program? Where exactly did they stand at that specific time?
Alarmingly far, and that's precisely the main reason why Israel felt compelled to take military action against it at this particular point in time, wouldn't you say? This debate is certainly quite old, and I believe that's something we should always keep reminding ourselves of. Israeli politicians and Israeli governments haven't just been issuing warnings about this nuclear program for a mere few months or even just a few years. Rather, they've been doing so for more than 30 years now. Indeed, the very first Israeli Prime Minister to explicitly sound the alarm was Yitzhak Rabin, the social democratic leader from the early 90s who courageously embarked on initiating what became known as the peace process with the Palestinians. I'd like to revisit that later because it holds particular importance for Western, especially German, policy toward Iran. This is due to the fact that Yitzhak Rabin, as early as the 90s, was already calling for, even pleading for, a significantly different approach to Iran, and unfortunately that never materialized. And that has led to the current situation where Israel now feels compelled, truly forced, to take military action against it. That's an area where one would need to delve deeply into the nuclear program, as it encompasses a multitude of diverse components. Uranium enrichment is a really central and crucial component, but it also involves other critical aspects. The development of nuclear warheads, and of course their ballistic missile program. Ultimately, all of these aspects are interconnected, particularly within uranium enrichment. The critical question consistently revolves around the enrichment percentage, and once a specific level is achieved, a percentage that might not initially appear alarmingly high, it very quickly becomes feasible to process it into weapons-grade uranium. They have indeed made rather dramatic progress in that regard over the past few months. And the other crucial aspect concerns the advancement of their nuclear warhead development. If I'm accurately interpreting the sometimes cryptic statements from Israeli politicians, this is precisely where it's become unequivocally clear that they've advanced significantly further than what was previously believed, especially in the West. Indeed, they've made alarming progress in this particular domain. It was quite striking, and I'll just add one more point. The IAEA, which usually remains rather reserved, always striving to present itself as an honest broker and impartial mediator, has now, with remarkable clarity, re-emphasized that Iran has failed to uphold its commitments, to which it is bound regarding such a nuclear program, and has not yet fully complied with them, and that they have taken very significant and advanced steps towards achieving actual nuclear armament. That's effectively the public aspect of it, where it's clear for all to see that indeed significant developments have unfolded over the past weeks and months. These quite evidently culminated in a situation where Israel felt truly compelled to take decisive, concrete action against it.
What kind of fighting, in your opinion, can still be expected to occur?
That's a prognosis for the future. It always reminds me of a nice quote from a former Austrian chancellor. Forecasts are inherently challenging, particularly when they pertain to future events. Nevertheless, based on the information currently available, one can endeavor to extrapolate a few meaningful conclusions. And one can quite simply regard the statements made by Israeli military personnel and politicians, in this particular instance, as exceptionally realistic predictions. Their primary message is unequivocally clear: this won't be resolved by tomorrow. No, this conflict will endure for precisely as long as Israel deems it absolutely essential to achieve its objectives and safeguard its security, primarily to significantly set back their nuclear weapons program and its development. Militarily, it's ultimately impossible to completely eliminate it, especially for Israel acting on its own. But to push it back so significantly that the primary objective is to gain more time to strongly advocate for other viable solutions for the nuclear program once again.
So, what's also noticeable about Iran is, first, the Iranian population has just been warned not to be in certain places. I'm just not entirely sure how someone living there would then put that into practice. But what's the overall relationship of the Iranian populace to this regime, and what's their relationship with Israel? I think there are a lot of things that are assumed from our perspective, from a Western perspective, that aren't true at all. So,
this is indeed a hostility that exists between the Iranian regime and both the Israeli state and its population. On the Israeli side, you can much more easily speak of a unity of government and population, so to speak. On the Iranian side, absolutely not. And that is indeed very important. I also believe that the addresses Benjamin Netanyahu has delivered, for instance, where he spoke directly to the Iranian populace, were both highly significant and utterly appropriate. He made it perfectly and unequivocally clear, publicly stating that these military actions are in no way directed against the Iranian populace, nor against the nation-state of Iran or the Iranian nation as a whole, but rather explicitly and solely against the regime itself. And this regime is now absolutely despised by a very significant portion, indeed by the overwhelming majority of the Iranian population. This wasn't always the situation, so Some Iranian opposition figures tend to paint this, I would say, in overly rosy pictures. They'd claim, oh, it was always just a tiny elite that occupied this country, and everyone was actually always against it. But of course, that's not true. So the Islamic Revolution in 1979 had a mass base, and indeed a very considerable one. And that situation, I would venture to say, persisted steadfastly until approximately the early 1990s. Since then, it's been a relatively continuous downhill slide, and in the last 10 years, it's been rapidly declining. So in the 90s, the opposition was definitely getting stronger and stronger. There were already mass protests against the regime back in the 90s. In the late 1990s, there was a very significant student movement that, just like in the subsequent years, was brutally and savagely suppressed by the regime. But this continued to develop throughout the 2000s. Over the past decade, we have consistently witnessed, at regular intervals, not mere demonstrations and protests, but truly immense and widespread mass demonstrations, extensive mass protests, and significant nationwide protest movements that are genuinely impacting the regime and placing it under considerable duress. I believe one can describe the timeline of this quite clearly and precisely. The first instance of its truly massive scale, which honestly pushed the regime to the very edge of collapse, occurred in 2009. In 2009, there was the supposed re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the then president, who almost certainly didn't actually win the election. Instead, it was most likely one of his two competitors, the more moderate politicians Mousavi or Karoubi, who had secured the victory. However, the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, who is the truly influential figure, the strongman who ultimately decides everything, stated, no, Ahmadinejad indeed won the elections. This pronouncement very swiftly and spontaneously triggered widespread mass protests across nearly all cities and major towns throughout Iran, and from that unrest a potent movement rapidly emerged which, at first they were demonstrating against this obvious election fraud. Where is my vote? Was the central slogan in the first few days, but very quickly it became, down with the dictatorship, down with the dictator. And then, at least from parts of this protest movement, Marg ba Jamhuriye-Islami, down with the Islamic Republic. This means that, out in the open on the streets, they were directly questioning the fundamental legitimacy of this political system. There are persistent rumors, difficult to verify even today, suggesting that around the time of the Ashura festival, late in 2009, the state leadership had already developed escape plans. They even had a helicopter on standby, as they were no longer confident they could regain control of the situation. And in that situation, and I'll get to the point of why these uprisings always fail in a moment, the US president at the time, Barack Obama, stood up and, in a speech, talked about the legitimate interests of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Why? Because even then, he was already betting on that atomic agreement, which ultimately passed 6 years later as well. And he told himself, well, I can't say I want to negotiate with you and at the same time support the people who want to overthrow you. So he essentially threw the demonstrators under the bus. And that was truly, it wasn't just morally reprehensible, abandoning those courageous people who were literally risking their lives fighting for their freedom, both political and individual. It was also deeply irresponsible and a huge strategic error. It was also incredibly politically imprudent, as if one considers how developments might have progressed in the Middle East. If in 2009, before the so-called Arab Spring, a different outcome had occurred, the Iranian regime had been overthrown, what kind of dynamic that would have triggered, you know? If the worst, most influential Islamist dictatorship had been overthrown, and only then these mass movements, which initially were indeed focused on democracy, had emerged in the Arab countries, that would have been an absolute game changer. And most importantly, the entire debate surrounding the nuclear program would have ceased to exist, wouldn't it? But unfortunately, a truly historic blunder was made, a mistake that some of Obama's extremely young advisors at the time, who essentially suggested it to him, now regretfully label as a grave error. Regrettably, it's far too late for that now. This error is then permanently repeated. Since 2009, these uprising movements occur regularly. The most recent one that gained significant attention here was Jin, Jiyan, Azadi, meaning woman, life, freedom. That was another movement that took place across the entire country, and they questioned the very foundations of the Iranian regime. Ideologically speaking, there are two things where there is absolutely no room for compromise. The dramatic gender apartheid, meaning the mandatory hijab. The Jin, Jiyan, Azadi movement was centered on that principle. That's precisely what ignited it. And the other aspect is eliminatory anti-Zionism, those persistent threats of annihilation against Israel, combined with a policy that actively strives to implement those very intentions. And against these things, significant parts of the Iranian opposition are now also directing their efforts, something that was quite different 20 years ago. You can sometimes see this in everyday life. I mean, it's difficult to conduct serious polls in countries like Iran. There are also possibilities with online tools. And it consistently becomes evident that classic anti-Semitic notions are significantly less prevalent there compared to, for instance, Egypt or the Palestinian territories, indeed, in numerous Arab societies. But also concerning the hatred directed towards Israel. Well, on the one hand, there's a segment of the political opposition that has, by this point, simply come to grasp how utterly absurd it would be if, on this singular issue, they were to essentially align with the regime's perspective. That's how it used to be. There were primarily leftist opposition groups who actively fought against the regime and rejected it, yet also harbored extreme hostility towards Israel. Some of them have truly undergone a change. They've genuinely broken away from their anti-Zionism and their hatred of Israel, now stating, okay, Israel is actually a potential ally for us. And in daily life, you'll notice that, particularly among young people, among students in Iran, there's a strong rejection of this anti-Zionist propaganda. And it's often quite simple. They observe the regime, which they unequivocally despise, and are determined to dismantle and eradicate. For them, this is extremely important, and now they simply say the exact opposite of whatever the regime says on every point. This results in such beautiful images. My last point, you can easily find this online. At numerous Iranian universities, Israeli flags and occasionally American flags are laid out on the ground right at the entrances. The expectation is that students will walk all over them daily, literally wiping their feet on these flags as they pass through. And in these recordings, you can observe the incredible efforts almost all students make just to avoid treading on that Israeli flag. Right? This is a positive development, sometimes even reflected in protest slogans like, "Not for Gaza, not for Lebanon." "I give my life only for Iran. They shouldn't have to give their lives for anything if possible." But that is an explicit rejection of supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon and also of supporting Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip. That is indeed a very positive development.
My follow-up question was just going to be, is it more this ideological direction that occupies the minds of the young people, or is it the entire population that is primarily concerned? Or is it also the sanctions, which mean economic cutbacks?
Well, it's actually both. We're talking about such an enormous group of people that, of course, they all have very different motivations. And I would assume that both factors play a role here. And one would then have to go through that in detail for the different groups that also exist within the opposition. But yes, even among the so-called normal population, which isn't heavily politicized, that last point holds significant importance naturally. They observe that this policy, enforced by the regime, irrespective of whether one deems it correct or incorrect, has consistently kept Iran teetering on the precipice of economic collapse for a considerable period of time. And they don't want that. They think it's bad. And many then say, well, just give up the nuclear program and stop always agitating against Israel. Then you can stay in power and everything will be fine and the sanctions will be lifted. That would be great.
Yes, the question of whether sanctions make sense or not is often discussed and how they affect the poor population. So I would think that sanctions should definitely be maintained, right?
Yes, I believe they shouldn't just be upheld, but they should be massively intensified because we are still nowhere near where we truly could be. However, I believe that now, which is why the military strikes are happening, the discussion about sanctions is already a bit outdated. For the Drop the Bomb Alliance, which we founded in 2007, that was indeed the central demand. There were, in fact, two core demands: stringent sanctions targeting the Iranian regime, coupled with robust support for the democratic, constitutional, and secular opposition.
What would you do now, as Western nations?
I'm not a political advisor. My aim is more to describe events, and at this moment, primarily to elucidate why we've reached a juncture where this discussion has become moot, given that Israel now felt compelled to resort to military intervention. The question before was always, is there a viable alternative to that? Because it's indeed a very risky step for Israel as well. We're already witnessing the initial counterstrikes. The first casualties have occurred in Israel. The situation could escalate and become significantly more dire. This is not a good solution that one could have eagerly awaited with anticipation and declared, yes, finally Israel can launch a counterattack. And also we are literally discussing the bombing of nuclear facilities here. A great many terrible things could still happen. We simply don't know what's coming. I think that what's currently happening is a necessary step, but definitely not a good approach. And we have honestly always tried to illustrate what the alternative would be, how such a situation could realistically be averted. And that is very much in keeping with precisely what all Israeli governments have demanded from Western politics, and specifically from Germany, since the early 1990s. I mentioned Yitzhak Rabin earlier. He was the first prime minister to receive the news that they were building nuclear weapons and the corresponding ballistic missile program. And Rabin responded to this in a very multifaceted manner. On the one hand, being a good Zionist who always assumes the worst and that Israel will be abandoned, he ordered the acquisition of long-range bombers. Israel didn't have them. Why? They always had to fight neighboring countries. You don't need incredibly expensive long-range bombers for that. He saw that it was possible in 20 years, if no one deals with this problem, that they would be forced to act on their own. So that was one thing. And the second point, which is actually missing from almost all German narratives of the so-called peace process, is that he was the one who initiated this peace process. This is connected to the Iranian nuclear program. That was one of his primary reasons for stating, we must strive to achieve peace with the Palestinians and our Arab neighbors, so that we can then fully dedicate our attention to Iran. I can express this in Rabin's exact words. He stated, we must neutralize the inner circle of danger, specifically the persistent conflict with the Palestinians and the neighboring Arab nations. This is crucial so that we can then focus our attention on the outer circle of danger, which is a potentially nuclear-armed Iranian regime. We really must revisit Rabin's perspective, because it is only by understanding his approach that we can truly and adequately assess both Western and particularly German policies. So for one thing, with the peace process, it worked on one point. The peace treaty signed with Jordan in 1994 is indeed a direct outcome of those efforts. When Rabin demanded this, there was only one Arab country that had peace with Israel, and that was Egypt. And Jordan then became the second. That is one of the concrete positive results of this strategy. It didn't work out with the Palestinians, nor with Lebanon or Syria and so forth, but that was the underlying idea. The other significant point Rabin made, which leads me to evaluating Western, particularly German policy, was that he instructed his ambassadors in all nations, especially among our allies, Germany explicitly included, to actively champion a different, entirely new policy towards Iran. He stated, don't politically court this regime, don't welcome these people, declare them pariahs, for they threaten our annihilation and build nuclear weapons, they deny the Holocaust. This isn't just some ordinary country, not some nation you dislike but must engage with. No, this is a pariah state, and it absolutely must be treated as such. And the second extremely crucial point was this. Every Israeli government since then has vigorously advocated for a policy of economic sanctions. This was founded on the entirely accurate understanding that the Iranian regime is only able to maintain its astronomically expensive nuclear weapons and missile program because European nations, with Germany at the forefront, continue to provide it with financial lifelines. With Germany at the forefront are doing billions in business with it, that is its lifeline. With this money, they finance their policies, including the nuclear weapons and missile program. What actions did the Western nations take, and what about Germany? It was quite the opposite. For about 30 years, they more or less completely disregarded and failed to properly respond to these requests. Well, 30 years is an exaggeration. From 2012, sanctions started, first light, then stronger. However, throughout the entirety of the 90s and well into the 2000s, Germany indeed pursued a policy that was quite the opposite. Germany, during this period, was indeed the closest partner in cooperation with the Iranian regime. One must truly state it as such, even within the intelligence sector, which is absolutely outrageous. It is, above all, the most important Western economic trading partner, and that remains the case today. And that brings me directly to the current German political landscape. Over the past 4 decades, no German administration has genuinely altered the multi-billion-dollar business dealings between German companies and Iran in any significant way. There were some cutbacks as part of the international sanctions which Germany reluctantly and very unwillingly went along with, but these measures were by no means sufficient enough. Even under the previous government, for the very first time, there was a female foreign minister who explicitly stated her intention to pursue a feminist foreign policy, which, in my opinion, is a very commendable endeavor. However, even she failed to substantially alter the circumstances, as a feminist uprising in Iran was brutally stifled with bloodshed. So indeed, there were a few rhetorical shifts, which one could almost say allowed them to be swept into a much clearer condemnation of the Iranian regime. But it remained in the realm of rhetoric. Substantially nothing has changed, and that also holds true for the new government so far. I'm genuinely open to being persuaded otherwise. My earnest hope is that the CDU, especially as I don't hold particularly strong hopes for the SPD on this matter, might yet reconsider their stance and finally initiate what I firmly believe is an urgent necessity, a complete and authentic 180-degree turnaround in Germany's policy concerning Iran. But so far it's not happening, and sadly it doesn't really look like it will, because that would genuinely signify, for one thing, an absolute cessation of all business operations with the Iranian regime. Germany remains its primary Western trading partner to this day. Even after October 7th, that hasn't shifted. Indeed, October 7th was only made possible through the Iranian regime's backing, and such support could only exist because German companies are still conducting billions in transactions with it. So you can put it this bluntly: German policy and German trade with Iran share responsibility for the massacres of October 7th. Nothing has changed in that regard. After October 7th, Ali Khamenei and numerous other representatives of the Iranian regime publicly praised these massacres, these pogroms, and this act of annihilation as being exemplary in every way. Even that didn't lead to anything. If you were pursuing a proper Iran policy, you would have had to say, at that point at the latest, we're closing the embassy, we're breaking off diplomatic relations because this is not a normal regime. We would simply make doing business with Iran a punishable offense, plain and simple. We would completely outlaw it, and in doing so attempt to contribute our part, however insignificant, to finally bringing this regime to heel, politically isolating it and severing its economic lifelines wherever feasible. We must deny them the resources they rely on.
Right. What I truly find to be an absolute irony of history is that tiny little Israel has to shoulder this immense task of saving itself, and in doing so is actually rendering a significant service to the Western world. If it came to a point where this regime was voted out of power, removed, or even overthrown, in your opinion, who do you believe would be capable of succeeding it and taking its place? What could follow? I mean, a democracy is always a huge, huge demand, a monumental aspiration, but it's not that easy to achieve. Or are the people there much more democratically educated and experienced than in other countries?
The latter, absolutely. And Iran actually boasts a very long and established tradition of liberal democratic developments. I like to remind people that in 1906, Iran had a constitutional revolution that demanded women's suffrage. Now, it's worth considering what was happening in Europe back in 1906. In many aspects, Iran was indeed more progressive than certain societies and regions across Europe during that period. And if you consider the developments prior to 1979, you can certainly see how progressive it was in numerous aspects. I mean, it remained a pro-Western dictatorship that utilized torture, which was in control at the time. However, from a societal perspective, it was a genuinely progressive country with an exceptionally high educational standard, a quality that hasn't completely disappeared over the last 40 years. So in that regard, I'd say the conditions over there aren't all that bad. Regarding the opposition, I personally feel it doesn't make a great deal of sense to discuss it in such an overly personalized manner. It is, of course, the Shah who is very frequently mentioned, and there are several other notable figures from specific opposition groups. The crucial point is that there's an Iranian opposition that is remarkably diverse, highly heterogeneous, and regrettably, as is nearly always the case, quite fragmented, both among those in exile and within the country itself. So many of these groups are, in fact, quite active inside the country. It originates from the monarchists, and they promptly divide themselves into constitutional monarchists. Those are individuals who desire a system like in Holland or Spain. Essentially, they want a constitutional democracy. The head of state, for whatever reason, should simply be the Shah, not some president, as far as I'm concerned. There are some who really want the monarchy back just like it was before '79. Other groups naturally criticize them sharply for good reason. You have the entire spectrum of bourgeois nationalist factions, social democrats, liberals and conservatives. There's a whole array of leftist and even far-left radical groups present in this context. Regarding the latter, I really don't think much credence should be given to them. Historically, they made common cause and even collaborated with Khomeini and the Islamists for a significant period. Then there's the influential and highly significant, yet quite disagreeable group known as the PMO. They played an important role, especially in exposing the nuclear program. Again, they are important also because they are relatively large in number and well organized. But even so, there's also massive criticism of them from other opposition groups, yet they will indeed play a role. And then there is the large group of people not organized in these traditional opposition groups, which I find particularly important for the future, specifically the JIN, JIYAN, AZADI movement. It wasn't genuinely led by organized opposition groups. Instead, these were individuals, frankly, utterly fed up with the regime, declaring enough is enough, and who have risen against this regime for deeply significant individual and political motivations. And then there's another critically important faction and various groupings that absolutely must be mentioned, the national minorities. These groups are often incredibly well organized in their opposition to the regime, and they are also quite naturally fragmented into a multitude of distinct political directions. But I want to mention at least one by name that I believe will play an important role also in the future overthrow of the regime. The Democratic Party of Kurdistan, Iran. It's a social democratic Kurdish Iranian movement, though of course they are constantly splitting, as is common in such a political process. However, these factions play a crucial role, with some operating as armed groups in Iraqi exile. They have frequently been subjected to attacks from the Iranian regime, even within Iraq, which highlights their precarious situation and the continuous threats they confront. They've just released an exceptionally strong statement regarding the current situation, unequivocally holding the Iranian regime accountable for these dire circumstances, explicitly stating their culpability. They don't attack Israel saying, "We oppose the regime but must defend Iran." No, they say, this situation is the way it is because the Islamic Republic of Iran, as it calls itself, pursues the policies that it does. And they state very clearly that as long as this regime is not overthrown, these problems will not disappear. So they advocate for that for years, for decades. At the Socialist International meetings where they are members, they've been trying to make this clear to other social democrats, including the Germans. But it must be said they haven't been very successful so far.
Mena-Watch, the independent Middle East think tank. Also, be sure to visit our website. There, you'll discover daily updated reports and in-depth, scientifically supported background analyses on the history and current affairs of the MENA region.